In 1999, in a small city in Japan, an 88-year-old man sat down to write a letter to the United States Congress. He was not a politician. He had not held public office in more than 50 years. He was, by the measure of the world, a private citizen. Old, quiet, living at some distance from the events that had made him briefly notable in a war that had ended before most of the people he was writing to had been born. But the letter he wrote that year was not a small thing. It crossed an ocean. It landed on the desks of senators and representatives. It was read into the congressional record, and it played a direct role in changing the official verdict of the United States Navy on a case that had been settled incorrectly 54 years earlier. The man's name was Mochitsura Hashimoto. He had been a commander in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the reason he was writing to the American Congress was to defend the reputation of the American naval officer he had helped destroy.
To understand who Hashimoto was, you have to go back to the summer of 1945, when the war in the Pacific had reached its final lethal phase. By July of that year, Japan's position was, by any honest accounting, finished. The Navy had been destroyed in a series of engagements stretching back 3 years. The Air Force was reduced to using its remaining pilots as weapons. The home islands were being systematically burned from the air. And yet, the military government in Tokyo had not surrendered, and the army was preparing for what it called the decisive battle on the home islands, a defense that military planners estimated would kill millions on both sides before it was over. In this context, Hashimoto commanded the submarine I-58, one of a dwindling number of Japanese submarines still operational in the Pacific. He had been at sea for years. He had served in the war from its earliest days. He was not a fanatic and not a fool. He was a professional naval officer, doing the only work he could.
What Hashimoto saw through his periscope that night was a large American heavy cruiser moving without escort through open water. The ship was the USS Indianapolis, a Portland-class heavy cruiser, 11,000 tons, carrying a crew of 1,196 men. She had just completed one of the most secret missions of the war, a high-speed run from the American mainland to the island of Tinian, where she had delivered the components and uranium core of Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima 5 days later. Hashimoto did not know this. He could not have known this. What he knew was that he had a large warship in his sights, traveling at reasonable speed, without zigzagging, and without escort. By the calculations of his trade, the opportunity was clear. What he did not use in the end were the Kai-10, the human torpedoes that I-58 carried. These were one-man submersibles, essentially converted torpedoes with a pilot sealed inside, intended to be guided directly into enemy holes by men who could not return. I-58 had them aboard. Hashimoto ordered regular Type 95 torpedoes instead. It was a decision of operational judgment, not mercy. The Kai-10 required different conditions. But it meant that what happened next was done by machines alone, without a single Japanese sailor sacrificing his life to do it.
At 14 minutes past midnight, on July the 30th, 1945, Hashimoto gave the order to fire. I-58 launched 6 Type 95 torpedoes in a spread. 2 of them hit. The first struck near the bow. The second hit beneath the bridge. Together, they tore open the forward section of the Indianapolis and detonated her fuel and ammunition stores. The ship began to go down immediately. Not slowly, not with time for organized evacuation, but in 12 minutes. 12 minutes from the first explosion to the moment the hull slipped below the surface of the Philippine Sea. In that time, the crew had to abandon a ship that was already on fire, already listing violently. In the middle of the night, without power
and without the ability to send a distress signal that was received. The ship sank so fast that many of the life rafts could not be released. Many men went into the water with only life preservers. The Indianapolis took its radio and its order of battle and its mission to the bottom. And nobody on the American side knew it was gone.
The failure that followed the sinking of the Indianapolis is one of the most extraordinary administrative collapses in the history of the United States Navy. The ship had been traveling from Guam to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines on a scheduled route. She was expected to arrive at Leyte on July the 31st. When she did not arrive, nothing happened. No search was ordered. No inquiry was made. The port authority at Leyte noted her non-arrival, but did not escalate it. The system that was supposed to track the movement of warships across the Pacific failed to notice or chose not to act on the absence of an 11,000-ton heavy cruiser. This was not a single person's failure. It was a procedural failure spread across multiple commands, each of which assumed that someone else was responsible for verifying that the Indianapolis had arrived safely. No one was. And so the men in the water waited.
What those men faced in the water over the next 4.5 days is one of the worst things that has ever happened to a group of American sailors. They were in the Philippine Sea, hundreds of miles from land, in water that was warm enough to keep them alive, but not warm enough to spare them the slow deterioration that comes from immersion, salt, thirst, and exposure. There was no fresh water. There was very little food on the rafts that had been successfully deployed. The men who had survived the sinking, somewhere between 800 and 900 out of 1,196, were scattered across miles of open ocean. Some were on rafts. Many were floating in life preservers. Many were not floating at all. And then the sharks came. The species that circled the survivors in those days was predominantly the oceanic whitetip, a pelagic shark, comfortable in open water, drawn by the blood and the noise and the sheer concentration of bodies that the sinking had put into its territory. The attacks began within hours and continued throughout the 4.5 days the men spent in the water. Men died of shark attacks. Men died of saltwater poisoning after drinking from the ocean in desperation. Men died of dehydration. Men died of
The rescue, when it came, was accidental. On August the 2nd, a Navy patrol aircraft on a routine anti-submarine mission, not a search flight, not a response to any distress call, but a scheduled patrol along a regular route, happened to fly over the area where the survivors were still in the water. The pilot saw the oil slick and the men below and radioed for help. What followed was a rapid rescue operation, but rapid was, by then, a relative word. 4.5 days had passed since the Indianapolis went down. Of the 1,196 men who had been aboard, 316 were pulled from the water alive. 880 men were dead. The largest loss of life at sea from a single ship in the history of the United States Navy. They had not died in the sinking, which had been fast and violent, but survivable for the majority of the crew.
The Navy's response to this disaster followed a pattern that disasters in large institutions often follow: the search for someone to blame that is calibrated to protect the institution itself. The failure to report the Indianapolis missing was a systemic failure, spread across multiple commands, multiple procedures, multiple officers, who had collectively produced an outcome where an 11,000-ton warship disappeared for 3.5 days without anyone being required to account for it. A full accounting of that failure would have required the Navy to examine and reform its own procedures in public in the immediate aftermath of the war's end, in front of a press and a public that were trying to process the largest military conflict in human history. What happened instead was that the Navy focused its public accountability on the commanding officer of the ship itself. His name was Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III. He was a decorated officer from a distinguished naval family. His father had been an admiral. He was 51 years old at the time of the sinking. He had survived the disaster and been rescued with his men. And in December of 1945, he was brought before a court-martial on charges of hazarding his vessel by failing to order evasive zigzag maneuvers on the night of July the 30th. He was the only commanding officer in the Second World War to be court-martialed for losing his ship to enemy action.
The decision to court-martial McVeigh was controversial for decades. The charge, failure to zigzag, was a tactical one, based on the principle that evasive maneuvers make a ship harder to target with a torpedo. McVeigh's defenders pointed out that he had been operating in waters that American naval intelligence had not classified as particularly dangerous, that zigzagging was a matter of commander's discretion rather than standing orders in his situation, and that the real failure, the catastrophic failure, was not in how the Indianapolis moved through the water, but in the fact that no one noticed she was gone for 3.5 days. That failure killed 880 men. McVeigh's decision not to zigzag may have contributed to the sinking, but it did not kill the men who died in the water while the Navy looked the other way. In a decision that was remarkable in its time, and would have been remarkable in any other time, the Navy flew Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto from Japan to Washington to testify at McVeigh's court-martial. This was December of 1945, 4 months after the end of the war, barely enough time for the occupation of Japan to establish the basic administrative structures that would govern the country for the next 7 years. Hashimoto arrived in Washington as the enemy, the man who had fired the torpedoes that sank the Indianapolis. He was asked to testify, under oath, about whether zigzagging would have made a significant difference to his ability to target and hit the Indianapolis on the night of July the 30th. His answer, carefully translated and entered into the record, was clear. It would not have made a significant difference. He had had a good firing solution. The ship was large, it was not moving erratically, but the geometry of the encounter was such that evasive maneuvers of that kind would not have protected her.
The logic of bringing Hashimoto to testify was almost certainly intended to strengthen the prosecution's case, to put the enemy submarine commander on the stand and have him explain in precise technical terms how he had sunk the Indianapolis and why McVeigh's behavior had contributed to it. What happened instead was that the prosecution's own witness provided testimony that undermined the central charge. Hashimoto said, plainly, that McVeigh's failure to zigzag had not been the decisive factor in the sinking. The ship would likely have been sunk regardless. The prosecution was not interested in this nuance, and it did not change the shape of the trial. The court-martial proceeded. McVeigh was convicted. He was convicted on the charge of hazarding his vessel through failure to zigzag, despite the testimony of the man who fired the torpedoes that the zigzagging would not have saved his ship. McVeigh was never sent to prison. The Secretary of the Navy remitted his sentence shortly after the trial. He was eventually restored to active duty, promoted, and retired with the rank of Rear Admiral. By the metrics of career outcomes, he survived the court-martial intact. What he did not survive was what came after.
Beginning almost immediately after the trial, and continuing for more than 2 decades, Charles McVeigh received letters. Thousands of them. They came from citizens who had read about the disaster in the newspapers. They came from the families of men who had died on the Indianapolis, or in the water afterward. They came every year, and they came especially on the anniversary of the sinking. And they blamed him, directly, personally, furiously,
for the deaths of 880 sailors. Some of the letters were measured, many were not. They told him he was a martyr. They told him he should have died with his men. They told him he should kill himself. The Navy's court-martial had, in effect, given official sanction to a narrative that made McVeigh personally responsible for the disaster. And that narrative was one that a portion of the American public embraced and held onto with a tenacity that the official record, the full facts, and the testimony of the man who had actually fired the torpedoes could not dislodge. McVeigh lived with this for 23 years. He retired in Virginia. He remained, by accounts of those who knew him, a dignified and private man who did not publicly complain about his treatment. He kept the letters. He answered some of them. And on November the 6th, 1968, he walked out to the yard of his home in Litchfield, Connecticut, holding a toy sailor figurine in one hand.
For 30 years after McVeigh's death, the verdict stood. The Navy did not revisit it. The history books recorded the court-martial as a settled matter. The survivors of the Indianapolis, the 316 men who had been pulled from the water alive, were divided on the question of McVeigh's culpability in a way that reflected the impossible position the Navy had put all of them in. Some blamed him. Some defended him fiercely. Some simply wanted the record corrected so that the true nature of the disaster, the systemic failure of the Navy's reporting procedures, could be acknowledged alongside the names of the men who had died waiting to be found. In the 1990s, the movement to exonerate McVeigh was renewed, partly through the efforts of survivors and their families, and partly through the work of a schoolboy in Pensacola, Florida, named Hunter Scott, who had seen the Indianapolis disaster referenced in the film Jaws and began researching the history. He became a public advocate for exoneration, eventually testifying before Congress alongside survivors of the disaster. The campaign gained momentum. Legislators introduced resolutions. Hearings were held. And at some point in this process, a letter arrived from Japan.
Mochitsura Hashimoto had not forgotten the Indianapolis. In the decades since the war, he had followed the story of McVeigh's court-martial and its aftermath with what can only be described as a sense of obligation that did not diminish with time. He had met, in the years since the war ended, American veterans of the Indianapolis, men who had survived the sinking and the water, men who had lost friends and shipmates to the sharks and the thirst and the long waiting. He had met them, spoken to them, and in some cases, corresponded with them. The experience of meeting the survivors of the ship he had sunk was not something Hashimoto processed in a simple way. What it produced over the years was a clarity about what had been done to McVeigh and why it was wrong. In 1999, at 88 years old, Hashimoto wrote his letter to the United States Senate. It was short. It was direct. It said, in its essential argument, that he had been brought to Washington to testify at McVeigh's court-martial in 1945, that his testimony had established that zigzagging would not have saved the Indianapolis, and that in light of this, in light of the fact that the man who had fired the torpedoes was saying directly that the charge against McVeigh was not supported by the evidence, McVeigh's conviction should be set aside. He wrote, "I have met many U.S. veterans of the Indianapolis. I would like to join them in urging the U.S. government to clear the name of the late Captain McVeigh."
The letter from Hashimoto was entered into the congressional record alongside the testimony of survivors and the advocacy of the families. It carried a weight that the other voices, however sincere, could not quite replicate, because it came from the person who occupied the most uncomfortable position in the entire moral geometry of the case. Hashimoto was the man who had sunk the Indianapolis. He was the man whose torpedoes had started the chain of events that killed 880 sailors and destroyed McVeigh's life. He was also the man whose testimony at the court-martial had made the clearest technical argument that McVeigh had not been responsible for the sinking in the way the Navy claimed. And now, more than 50 years later, he was doing it again. Not under oath, not in a courtroom, but in a letter to a legislature, saying the same thing he had said in 1945. This conviction is not supported by the facts. There is a word in Japanese that is relevant here, though Hashimoto himself never used it publicly in this context. The idea of moral responsibility that extends beyond the end of hostilities, the idea that an enemy could owe something to another enemy's memory, was not a Western legal concept. It was something more difficult to categorize. What Hashimoto was doing in writing that letter was not an...
The United States Congress passed a resolution in October of 2000, clearing Charles McVeigh of all responsibility for the loss of the Indianapolis. The Navy amended the official record to reflect the exoneration. It was not a reversal of the court-martial itself. That verdict technically remained. But it was an official congressional statement that McVeigh's record should reflect his exoneration and that he was not responsible for the loss of his ship. For the survivors who were still alive, for the families of those who were not, and for the historians who had spent years documenting the full arc of the disaster, it was a recognition that had been 55 years in coming. McVeigh himself had been dead for 32 years. Mochitsura Hashimoto died on December the 25th, 2000, the same year that the exoneration passed. He was 89 years old. He had lived to see the thing he had asked for happen. He died in the year his letter had helped to make possible, 3 months after the Congress whose members he had addressed took the action he had requested. The symmetry is not neat, and it is not satisfying in the way that clean endings are supposed to be satisfying. But it is the kind of symmetry that history occasionally produces. Two men on opposite sides of an event, both of them damaged by it in different ways, arriving at the same conclusion about what was right. One of them too late to see it, and one of them just barely in time.
What makes this story worth telling is not that it ends in redemption. It doesn't, not entirely. McVeigh was exonerated by a Congress that was not yet born when he was convicted, after he had been dead for 3 decades. Hashimoto died in the same year the resolution passed, having spent 55 years carrying the knowledge of what he had done to the Indianapolis and what had then been done to McVeigh by the Navy that was supposed to take responsibility for its own failures. Redemption is not quite the right word for any of this. What the story contains, instead, is something rarer and more useful. A demonstration of what moral clarity looks like when it comes from an unlikely place. Hashimoto did not have to write that letter. He had no legal obligation. He had no political incentive. He was 88 years old and living quietly in Japan, and the man whose name he was defending had killed himself 31 years earlier. The Navy that had convicted McVeigh was not going to sanction Hashimoto for staying silent. The survivors of the Indianapolis who blamed McVeigh were not going to thank him for speaking up. There was no version of writing that letter that made Hashimoto's life easier or his reputation larger. He wrote it because it was accurate. Because accuracy, in this case, required correcting a wrong that he understood better than anyone alive, having been the one who pulled the trigger.
The case of Charles McVeigh is also a case study in what happens when an institution uses accountability as a shield. The Navy's systemic failure in the aftermath of the sinking, the 3.5 days in which an 11,000-ton warship went unreported as missing while its crew died in the water, was a failure of process, of oversight, of the basic administrative function of knowing where your ships are. Prosecuting McVeigh did not fix that failure. It did not change the procedures that had allowed the Indianapolis to go unreported. It did not result in any meaningful reform of the system that had failed. What it did was give the press and the public a name and a face to attach to a disaster. And in doing so, it absorbed the momentum of outrage that might otherwise have forced a harder examination of the institution itself. This is not a pattern unique to the United States Navy in 1945. It is a pattern that large institutions, under pressure, have returned to throughout history. Find the person most exposed, prosecute them visibly, and use the prosecution to signal accountability, while leaving the structural failures intact. McVeigh was the most exposed person in the Indianapolis disaster, the commanding officer, the man whose name was on the ship's log.
There is one more thing about Hashimoto's letter that deserves attention, and it is this. He wrote it in English. He was 88 years old. He had commanded a submarine in a war that had ended 54 years earlier. He was writing to a foreign legislature in a language that was not his own, on behalf of an officer he had never met, who had been dead since 1968, to correct a verdict that had been issued by a court he had helped the prosecution lose its own case in. The letter was direct and economical. It did not dramatize, it did not argue at length. It simply stated the facts as Hashimoto understood them, said what he believed the Congress should do, and signed his name. There are easier ways to spend one's 88th year. The ease of staying silent, of letting the history stay as it was, of not traveling back, even on paper, to the worst thing you ever did was available to him. He did not take it. And the reason he did not take it was the same reason that makes this story worth more than its particulars. Because he had met the survivors. He had sat across from men who had been in the water for 4.5 days and had watched their shipmates die. And in meeting them, he had understood, more completely than any document could explain, what the chain of events he had begun on the night of July the 30th had actually cost. That understanding accumulated over decades.
Next on Torah Files, while American cities feared invasion, Japan was already attacking them with a weapon America refused to admit existed. Torah Files tells the untold history of the Pacific War, one episode at a time. Subscribe to see the next chapter.